As Frank will discuss in a few moments, we are no longer passive consumers of mass media or spectators. Now, thanks to Google+, we hope, Twitter, and YouTube, we are media. Storytelling is no longer linear, and we are frequently asked to participate. This new narrative is still nascent, but continues to gain momentum. The Art of Immersion examines the blurred lines between author and audience, story and game, entertainment and marketing, and fiction and reality, what we call deep media. Just so you guys know, this might run a couple of times through this talk. It's actually our freight elevator, so if you hear that, just sort of go with it. Following Frank's talk about the Art of Immersion, he'll be joined by some transmedia pioneers for a conversation about the changing nature of storytelling, collaborative production, and how these immersive experiences actually come to fruition. So please join me in welcoming Frank.
Thank you. Hi. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about grammar today, but don't worry, it doesn't have anything to do with linguistics. I'm going to talk about the grammar of storytelling, how it's evolving, why it's evolving, and why that matters to us. So, as Janine pointed out, I wrote this book. It's about how the internet is changing storytelling, essentially. And the thing about storytelling is that it's always been mediated by technology, by whatever technology is at hand. And as I was working on the book, I realized early on that every medium has its own grammar. Cinema, for example. We take for granted the grammar of cinema because we're used to watching movies. People have been watching movies now for 100 years or more. But all of the parts of that grammar, crosscuts, fades, point of view shots, even a close-up, they all had to be invented. They weren't there at the beginning. And so the motion picture camera was invented around 1890. And for a long time, for a number of years, the sort of typical shot was what's called the proscenium arch shot, which is to say, as if the camera were set in amid the audience, looking up at the action taking place on stage. By this, all of these other shots and the cutting and so forth, all that happened gradually over a period of years. It wasn't really consolidated until about 1915. And in fact, it was 1910 before they even came up with the idea of movie stars. What essentially happened was we had a 20-year period from the invention of the camera to the idea of putting stars in front of it, and another 5 years after that before the grammar really coalesced, and 12 more, of course, till we got sound. So as it happens, it's been about 20 years now since the birth of the web. And we're still figuring that out too. What I realized when I was working on the book is that every new medium seems to take about 20 or 30 years for people to figure out what to do with it. And in the meantime, we have what I've come to call the horseless carriage phase. Transitional, obviously, when we don't really understand the possibilities of the new technology. As with the proscenium arch shot, we just continue doing what we've done in the past. But it's not just a question of seeing the new in terms of the old. It's also defining the new in terms of what it's lacking, rather than what it can become. So I think that's what's happened with the internet. A lot of internet critics are basically saying, where's the horse? Social media devalues friendship. Where's the horse? Google makes me stupid. Where's the horse? Bloggers don't have proper journalism credentials. Where is the horse? Well, the horse is gone and it's not coming back. So what do we have instead? we have essentially a medium that consists of all media, that is video, audio, print, any combination of the above, and that can be used in a way that's inherently nonlinear, that is also inherently participatory. It encourages people to jump in, to act. As a result, it's often game-like. It has the capability of being immersive, and it blurs boundaries, relentlessly. The boundary between author and audience, between fiction and reality, between story and game, and between entertainment and marketing. In the process of all this, it really changes the way we think. For example, I'm going to talk for a moment about nonlinearity and what that does. So nonlinear storytelling is not new, of course. In the 20th century, it was pretty much the province of the avant-garde. You had James Joyce, you had Jorge Luis Borges, you had Akira Kurosawa, Jean-Luc Godard. Godard, in a debate at Cannes in the mid-60s, was famously asked if he didn't think a story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, to which he replied, certainly, but not necessarily in that order. This kind of nonlinear storytelling was self-conscious, it was intellectual and arty. It was essentially calling attention to the illusion that is narrative, which is kind of a no-no in, certainly classical Hollywood cinema and fiction in general. But then something strange started to happen. By the mid-90s, nonlinearity had been absorbed by the culture to the point that Quentin Tarantino could release Pulp Fiction, a movie that to most studio executives at the time was utterly unwatchable. And yet, to a new generation of viewers, it was an entirely natural way to tell a story. Nonlinearity was going mainstream. Within a few years, you had Christopher Nolan's Memento. You had David Lynch making Mulholland Drive. I talked to Lynch when I was working on the book because I wanted to ask him about this whole question of nonlinearity, where it's coming from, why it's become popular. And what he said really suggested to me television. And when you think about it, television is an extremely nonlinear experience. We're trained not to think of it this way. We're trained to think of discrete elements. We watch the TV show, there's a break, we watch the news, we watch some ads, we go back to the show. But in fact, this is an extremely disjointed and nonlinear experience. And then, of course, you had the web coming in, a technology that's a medium that's essentially based on, because of hyperlinks, it's essentially based on the whole idea of nonlinearity. In 2005, Alyssa Quart, a film critic writing in Film Comment, coined the term hyperlink cinema. And a few months after that, Roger Ebert, in a review of Syriana, used the same term. And he wanted to give credit to Alyssa Quart, but unfortunately, as he pointed out, irony of ironies, I've lost the link. So there's one more thing about the horse's carriage analogy. Not only does it lack a horse, but it's still a carriage. People are trying to construct, at this point, with the internet, the equivalent of a purpose-built motor car. That's kind of where we are with storytelling right now. We know the parameters. We know that it encourages nonlinearity, that it has to be participatory in some way, all of these things. But that doesn't tell us how to use these things. It doesn't tell you the grammar. We still have to create that. And this book that I've written is really a meta-narrative about the search for this new grammar. For me, it's been really a kind of an extraordinary journey. And it began with 3 stories that I did for Wired over a period of a couple of years before I actually started the book and before I had even the idea for the book. The first one was a piece on 3D, for which I interviewed James Cameron in the fall of 2006. At that point, Avatar had not yet been greenlit. He had it in development. He'd had it in development for some time. He was in Montreal on a soundstage where they were making Journey to the Center of the Earth, 3D, which was the first feature film to use the 3D camera system that he and Vince Pace had invented. So I went up there, and it turned out he had a lot of free time, which was great. And so we talked about Avatar to a fair amount. And in particular, he talked about that kind of science fiction story as one that was ideal for creating a sort of a fractal-like complexity, as he put it. So the casual viewer could just see the movie. But for the real fan, you could jump in another order of magnitude, and the pattern would still hold up. That really, you could have stories of almost infinite levels of depth. Immersive entertainment, just like Star Wars has become, which of course Star Wars was the movie that inspired Cameron to become a director in the first place. About a year after that, I did a story on Year Zero, the alternate reality game. It was really a piece on the whole idea of alternate reality games, and we picked that as the the one to focus on. It's an incredibly immersive experience based on the Nine Inch Nails album called Year Zero. Trent Reznor had made this album. He had a problem. He had essentially created a concept album, but at a time when nobody buys albums anymore, and certainly they don't buy albums that come with liner notes and the like. So his problem was, what are you supposed to do? How do you even convey to people that this is a concept album, much less what the concept is? And in his case, it was a completely fascinating story about America as a theocratic police state 15 years in the future. So he engaged Susan Bonds, who's the CEO of 42 Entertainment, who is here, by the way. She's going to join us in a few minutes. And Alex Liu, who works with her. And the result was a game that played out over a period of many months and drew about 2.5 million people. Alternate reality games like this really do blur the line. They blur the line between story and game. You have essentially a series of riddles and puzzles and treasure hunts that unlock a story which the players then tell to each other online. So in a sense, they become the owners of it. And at the same time, they blur the line between fiction and reality. You have real events taking place in a fictional world, except that it can't be fictional because we're in it. And it's not on screen or on stage, it's happening all around us. Finally, it blurs the line between marketing and entertainment. It's fun, but it also builds a lot of excitement about whatever it is that it's connected to, whether it's Year Zero or subsequently 42 did one for The Dark Knight. In fact, one of the first alternate reality games was commissioned by Microsoft for the release of Halo 2. That was called I Love Bees. And the person who did that, Chris Di Cesare, is also going to join us in a few minutes. He was at Microsoft Game Studios at the time, and he told me when I was interviewing him for the book that he thought he might get fired over this. He was spending $1 million in an unproven medium for a marketing effort that he couldn't even admit existed. And yet its success was supposed to be measured in the amount of publicity it drew. So actually he didn't get fired, but he did end up at Google sometime later. So we'll hear from him. And finally, I did a story about a year after that about Hollywood getting into the whole idea of web video. This was as a result of the writer's strike largely. Film and television writers, obviously during the strike, they couldn't write for film or television, but they could write for the web. So a lot of them did. And I came across a lot of people, or several people, who had started off as TV writers and then had gone into video games. working for Activision or working for Electronic Arts, which of course has a huge studio in Playa Vista. And they were wondering how you could really combine the two. That's kind of what their motivation was in doing this. And at the same time, there was another question, which how do you pay for these things? They didn't have a big enough audience really to be supported by conventional commercials. And the infrastructure for that wasn't even in place at that point anyway. So what happened was you had a lot of product placement. You had what has come to be known as branded entertainment, where sort of brands and storytellers got together and did something. So we have a couple of people here also who are experts in that in one form or another. Paul Woolmington from Naked Communications, a branding agency that's based in London. It has a big office here and many other places in the world. And Ted Hope, who's one of the leading indie producers in the US, indie film producers. He's produced such films as 21 Grams, The Laramie Project, American Splendor, the list goes on. So the final question I want to get back to is, why does all of this matter? Why is storytelling so important? Why is it so basic to us? I think it's because stories put information in a framework. They're essentially processing mechanisms. They create a signal within the noise. And that's how we process information. We're capable of following instructions. We can use a recipe, we can go through a checklist. We can follow a set of instructions. But we're not really that good at it because we're not such particularly methodical creatures. Instruction sets are essentially lists, and lists are very hard to learn. Stories are easy to learn because they give you something to grab onto. They're a way to store memories, which is why I think that it's fair to say that stories are to humans as algorithms are to machines. So that's where we stand. It's 2011. We think we live on internet time, but that's really just things coming at us. It doesn't have anything to do with our ability to process them. And the truth is, we're still groping towards something new. It's a really essential and completely exciting phase, I think. But we might as well be trying to make movies in 1911. People were feeling pretty good about it back then, too. Nickelodeon's so 1908. They'd figured out movie stars. They'd mastered the jump cut and the fade. But spoken dialogue was still years away. And color, it was hard to even imagine what color would look like. So who's going to figure this one out? Who's going to take the next step? Construct a new grammar of storytelling for us now. When we know that, I think we'll know how this meta story is going to end. Thank you.
So as we smoothly transition into this next part of the, I'm Paul Woolmington from Naked Communications, and Frank has very eloquently introduced all of us, so I'm not going to do all those boring introductions. I know, I feel like a juggernaut lorry is about to sort of crash through the... Anyway, Janine asked if I would very informally moderate and or sort of stimulate the conversation, and I think the rule number one is to really just keep out of the way and let the conversation flow. So I just wanted to maybe kick off, and we'll try and leave a little bit of time for obviously audience participation, and I'm sure you've got some questions which might elaborate on Frank's early point. So I just wanted to kick off with Susan. Susan, it occurred to me that you have been doing this, trying to figure this out for longer than most, from what Frank was saying. Any observations from you where we stand today, because we were just even discourse we had a little earlier. You were saying like Twitter didn't exist but a few years ago, and you were doing some of these amazing transmedia, whatever you want to call it, narratives way before that. But just any observations from when you first started producing, amazing non-linear stories to where it stands today?
Well, absolutely. So I think it is really this kind of strange juxtaposition of the fact that storytelling is as old as, anything that we can remember, and it's an essential part of our life, and it's something that people don't have to teach us. We all know how to tell a story. I'm sure you guys can tell a good story here. So it's like something that's, really part of who we are, and combining that with, the fact that not only is technology moving at a rapid pace, but also the way we interact as a society, the way we interact in our social groups, the way we interact with each other, the fact that we're now all connected, which is something I don't have to explain to this room. So I think that we try to approach it from the viewpoint of like, wherever we are, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to tell a story that connects people. And the fact that we are so connected actually is an opportunity in itself. The one thing that was true 10 years ago and is true today is that the web gives you instant feedback. So as a creative storyteller, you have to deal with that. And when you let people into your world and into your story, you then have to deal with their expectations. So I think overall, if you look over the past decade, people's expectations have grown significantly. And now what used to be surprising and novel is expected. And if you don't do that, then bad mark on you. So it's interesting to see how things have evolved. And I don't know if like you guys probably felt like I did when you saw The Social Network. It's like, wow, that was 2004. Oh my God. It's like the world has changed so fast. And again, like what happens here at Google, it's like keeping up with it is in one sense, it's challenging, but in the other sense, it's natural. This is a natural evolution. That's why anybody can do it. It's because it's just like the way things are going.
Chris, do you make comments?
The thing that I think is interesting is just as time has gone on, how brands have learned how they have to accept the consumer participation, dialogue in the process. I worked a lot on YouTube. One of the stories that I remember, and it's just a little different than storytelling, but it goes back to that kind of, remember the whole Diet Coke Mentos spots when those videos first appeared, and how the brands dealt with that so differently. Like Mentos just shipped boxes of Mentos to the guys behind it, where I think it was Diet Coke was like, okay, we got to stop this. We can't have them. They're fucking with our brand over here. We can't have that. So and I think brands now have kind of gone, all right, they have to figure out how to have them participate in that process. It's just evolution.
That was an interesting inflection point, wasn't it? That classic, people going white knuckles in the Coke boardroom, and then suddenly, and Mentos on the opposite were like, they were going, yay, we're the little guys.
Exactly.
And we were going, yay. And the Coke guys going, oh my God, what exploding Coke. I'm going to quote from Frank's book, a lovely little quote that I actually used in a presentation. I was telling him, in a command and control world, we know who is telling the story. It's the author. But digital media and this new era has created an authorship crisis. Once the audience is free to step into the fiction and start directing events, the entire edifice of the 20th century mass media begins to crumble. But Ted, you've been deeply involved in obviously working with writers and incredible directors and actors. I just wondered, what excites you about this blurred line between audience and author? Any comments, any thoughts about how that inflection point is starting to change your world, or might?
No, quite a few. It's interesting. I think that the brands are actually far more progressive than the artists or authors are. In terms of what's attracted me to whether it's, transmedia or deep media storytelling, part of it is trying to confront the superabundance of stories, of content that's out there. It's the friends of mine who worked in the film festival submission world clocked it at, they thought that around about 45,000 titles are generated a year. Wow. 45,000 titles. And the US market currently is thought to be able to consume about 600 theatrical titles a year, of which 125 are studios, which means that the available market share for the world supply is 1% a year of the world supply. And that's this year. You know, next year there's still another 44,400 films that weren't seen, so it's down to, 0.55%. And then you look at how fast the past is digitized. On top of that, you could say today, I want to live in 1968 and do that more fully than you could in 1968, and just see content from that. So as a filmmaker and as an artist, how do I get my films seen? And to think that the feature film form, even quality storytelling, even corporately backed quality storytelling is enough to get traction with the global audience is foolish. Yeah. The one advantage I have to somebody like Kurosawa, a far better storyteller than I, is that I'm not dead. That I actually
you got one advantage.
That's it. I can make my stories penetrate deeper in many different ways. Yeah. But when I start talking to the directors and writers that I work with, and I say, this bit of the script, I don't actually think we should provide that plot point. I think we should keep it a little open-ended here, and not try to spell this out so that later we can have an opening to go back to. They kind of look at me, and who goes back to do that? What are you talking about? Oh, well, it doesn't have to be you. Maybe it's going to be someone in the audience that got... and it just stops, And it's so hard to try to start to get people to start to look at, like, how do we start making these films be a two-way street where there's a place that people can participate.
Yeah, Frank, I'd love to bring you back in at this point on that, the blurred line between author and audience. At what point will there be an inflection point on the demise of the mass media? Because obviously we've got a lot of Googlers here,
right? But I think that I think that if anything, the people who are doing the kind of thing that I'm talking about, often err on the side of abdicating, the storytelling, and the people, as you were saying, Ted, who are more used to doing a much more traditional form of storytelling, take it the opposite way. I think that the only reason that people become interested in a story in the first place is because it's a great story. Whether it's Star Wars, whether it's Avatar, whether it's Harry Potter, the question, the trick really becomes, how do you balance that, and how do you leave openings, as you were saying, Ted? How do you leave openings for, the audience to come in? I had this conversation with Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse when I was interviewing them for the book. They were the showrunners, of course, of Lost. And what they said was that they felt that the show kind of gave the illusion of interactivity, but in fact wasn't really. But in a way, that wasn't entirely true, because what happened with that story, number one, that was an extremely controlled bit of storytelling. It went on for, 6 years. It was an extremely selective release of information. And it was so complicated that essentially what happened was the audience had to get together online just to figure out what the story was. Yeah. So you had things like Lostpedia, which was specifically founded by, started by some guy who in Anchorage, Alaska, who had watched the entire first season in a couple of nights before the second season started. And then he, watched the first show of the second season, and he had a complete WTF moment. So he went online to find out, what was going on. And he didn't find anything except a few, sort of like discussion threads. So he decided to start a wiki on it. And he was familiar enough with the Wikipedia software that he had it up and running in about 6 hours. Now it's in 19 or 20 languages. There are thousands of articles. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, no, that's great. Chris, I was going to bring you in at this point a bit more. Having worked obviously at Microsoft, having been a marketeer, having I guess also participated in creating something with Susan back along. I'm just wondering, what do you think that computer and video games, why they've had such a disruptive influence on the overall entertainment industry? Because obviously, we still talk about Hollywood and of course everyone knows the statistic. Hollywood, gets the lion's share of the ink, but gaming has sort of long since surpassed it in terms of gross revenues. And how's that obviously changing the way, we do things?
I think video games, just the evolution over time. I mean, that first and foremost, it just puts you at the center of the experience. So being able to live that role provides that degree of immersiveness that I think everyone's striving for. I mean, I think that's touched on in the book, and like everyone wants to go deeper, get closer to the characters and so forth. And it's kind of one of these things where I think people in video games kind of admire the storytellers in Hollywood, and the Hollywood guys kind of go, oh, I want to be more, kind of closer to the game, and they both kind of battle it out to figure out which way it's going. I think in gaming in general, just as technology is advanced, you're able to add, the characters have had more dimension to them, so that like a category unto itself, like a shooter, right? In the past, all the shooters are the same, like just blow things up. But now you're able to tell more richer, deeper stories. And I think that was the thing, like on Halo, the property I was involved with, it was similar to Star Wars in a way where they didn't think of themselves as creating a game. They were thinking of creating a universe first and foremost that people could play in. And I think now as technology is advanced, you can kind of see that, get closer to the characters. And you see it happen when a video game can now sell, have best-selling books and so forth. They want to get closer to it.
Yeah, Susan, just to pick up on that, because obviously a lot of the activities you've created have a lot of play. I mean, clearly there's sort of players inherent in everything that you're doing, but how do you codify this? Do you think about these spurs, these behavioral spurs? I mean, or is it sort of tell us a little bit about the creative process that you go through. I mean, are there any examples you can give, or whether you have methodologies that you use, these different inflection points?
Well, so just to echo what Chris is saying, I think when you watch a story and you see the knight save the village or get the girl, it's like, well, I want to be that person. I want to be the hero of the story. I mean, we all remember The Matrix when Neo got the package and he ripped it open. There's a phone and it says, "Follow the White Rabbit," and you're like, I want to do that. And that was one of our goals, was just to essentially create that moment, that Matrix moment, where the phone rings, you're given instructions, and then you're off. You have no idea where you're going. So as part of the Year Zero project that Frank was mentioning, we had created a world that was obviously being sent back in pieces, kind of 15 years from the future, and the players were kind of deciphering it and putting it together. What's the vision of this world? In a way, it was kind of like narrative archaeology. We're getting these shards, these little bits of glimpses of digital media that are reflective of the society of the day. Well, what were those people like? What are the issues they're dealing with? And as part of that, we wanted to transfer that somehow a sense of urgency to today. So one of the things that we did is that we introduced the idea that in the future, you were going to lose things that were very basic to you, and that one of the ways that people were fighting back was through art. And one of the messages was the fact that you have a voice. And you don't have to necessarily agree with me, but you just need to speak up. And this was kind of something that people could hold on to that had relevance for them. So I think that in the video game genre, you can be the hero, but if you can somehow make it relevant to the point where you now see the world through the game layer or the alternate reality or whatever it is that you put over it, then you kind of have a win, because you're really giving people a different point of reference, which they have a very personal connection to. It's like, well, I'm the hero of this story, and it's making me think about this. And so, I mean, I think that's a good example of how, you know, if you create that personal moment, I do agree that there has to be a balance between a story that you're in a world, I will say this, a world that you're creating that's fully realized in detail that people can play in, and then you give them a path through that, or give them the tools to you know, really add value to the world.
Yeah,
And it's curious. The films that I've done are, you know, independent films, which probably best way to describe them is they're really kind of personal tales, real life, raw emotion. And as I've wanted to explore a different way of telling stories, I've moved more into some genre topics of you know, superheroes and horror, mostly because it's in sci-fi, because it allows you more free reign. But I've continued to strive to try to figure out how you can expand beyond a feature film narrative within a kind of more traditional story. And you know, a lot of the films that I've made have had unsympathetic characters at their center, that I've always been drawn to you know, how films create empathy, how you can start to understand somebody who you normally wouldn't ever want to be in contact with in other situations. And as I start to push the writers and directors that I work with to really try to consider a multi-platform mode of storytelling, you know, we often will say, okay, do these supporting characters, can we do a Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, you know, device, and kind of focus a little bit on a supporting character? We had a film this year that won Best Director at the Sundance Film Festival called Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene. And it's the story of a young woman who had been abducted into a cult. And as the movie opens, she escapes and reunites with her sister who she was estranged from, but her mind's been blown and she's suspecting the cult's coming to get her. And well, you'll have to go see the movie when it comes out this fall. But before we ever did that, I kept pushing the filmmakers to try to write 5 short pieces about the different members of the cult. I got one done, and but we made a short film. And you know, it's kind of curious when you think of the different levels of audiences. You know, some audiences want to drill down really deep and really engage. You know, for me as a producer, my audiences frequently start with the financiers and then the actors and then the distributors. You know, how do I reach them? And so this short was kind of made for the audience of the film festivals in some ways. We made this short film with some of the characters we cast in the feature film in the same story world that we later made the feature in. And it went to the Sundance. It went to the New York Film Festival. It won a prize in Cannes. And that's exactly the path that the feature now is going, because it was the discovery mechanism for that audience of how they came to discover this filmmaker and this story. And you know, I think that trying to come up with ways that we do it in a non-genre context where it isn't the glimpse of a futuristic world or the threat or things that kind of run on more gaming principles, how do we encourage engagement across platform without necessarily using game mechanics is another place where there's going to be a lot of growth and a lot of, you know, soul searching in some ways of trying to figure out. So if you can figure that part out, Susan.
Wow. So I kind of think of, you know, I understand what you're saying about telling personal stories and certainly about unsympathetic characters, but we've always tried to, and this isn't a game theory, this is a storytelling principle. It's like, we'll figure out something that resonates with everyone, you know? So like, for example, when we were when I was working with Chris and we were talking about Halo, it was more than just, well, first of all, they had built this fully realized world, right? So it's how do we make it personal to us? And, you know, the idea came up about telling a War of the World story, you know, because we've all thought of that moment of like, well, what if something unexpected happens? What do you do? How do you handle it? Obviously, that was the whole beauty of War of the Worlds, is it felt like it was really happening. So like, how do we take that and modernize it? And
but I would actually say that the whole beauty, and I think this is something that Frank hits in his book, is actually that it was a trick, which made it a story that we could pass on. So my son knows of War of the Worlds as a prank. And that's so exciting to him that somebody could have pranked the nation.
Prank the nation.
You know,
I think
with
Google
that,
could prank the
you know.
nation. I'm waiting for that.
But the thing is, I think like a lot of in the ARGs or in the War of the Worlds premise as a whole, what's interesting is that you have this kind of umbrella story, but the real kind of thing that drives it is not the story itself, I find, but the stories from the participants and their engagement, their involvement in the actual process. Like, you know, for the I Love Bees thing, people, they didn't talk about like, okay, what was the story that they talked about, the War of the Worlds? It was more like, well, there was this guy who was battling a hurricane in order to get to a payphone, in order to pick up the phone, because the story had to go on. Like those human stories really became what drove it, because it was a unique way of telling stories.
Frank, any thoughts on that?
You know, I think that, I mean, one of the things I was really fascinated by when I was working on the book was I did a series of interviews with Howard Rothman, who's in charge of the Star Wars Expanded Universe at Lucasfilm. And essentially, although we didn't exactly talk about it in these terms, what we got into was the whole idea of story worlds. I mean, it's a phrase that's become a bit more popularized now. But what he was saying was that, you know, George Lucas, when he was first making the films, when he started making the films, he created this, what Lucas called immaculate reality of, he realized every detail. And he didn't do that, Howard pointed out, because he thought you could spin stories off of it, spin more stories off of it. He did it because that's what you have to do in order to make something seem real. When the whole thing is made up, when there is no planet Tatooine, there is no, you know, there are no moisture farmers. I'm sorry. We'll talk later. But ultimately what happened was that because the world that he created was so incredibly rich in detail, it meant that there were all of these sort of handholds, you know, that you could grab onto and use to spin more stories off of. I was just sort of fascinated by that. I always thought that was a great...
Yeah, Frank and I played this game a while ago, a month or so ago, and I just wanted to bring Ted in on this one. Okay, in a storytelling duel, who, in your opinion, would win? Dickens, Lucas, Spielberg, or J.J. Abrams? or you can add, you know, who you think could.
You know, it's. I think in the same sort of way, the folks who make the biggest myths, you know, whether it's, you know, the Grimm brothers, you know, Greek mythology, the Bible, you know, any of those things that allow people to take for themselves and spin again works really well. So the folks that were a little less hung up on their own authorship, I think actually probably wins, because they generate more stories, whether they're the pen or not, you know, would be my argument. So maybe not those folks at all, folks who had maybe a slight lesser output themselves, but allowed other people to take those tales and run with it, you know. And I think it's part of the problem is that we still hold up these big storytelling gods and link their name, and yet, you know, in terms of the filmmakers, you know, they, for the most part, you could argue that what Lucas later, you know, ultimately what Lucas has created extends well beyond the features in a much stronger way. But the dominance of the feature film form, you know, as our prime, you know, financial vehicle, I think has limited people's ability to launch new characters, to not launch new worlds. And that, as we start to, as filmmakers loosen up and kind of can see themselves more as, kind of a brand that can speak in different formats, across different genres, in different time lengths. They can put out all of these little pieces. And to me, like the beauty of a story that you start, today, but I don't actually plan to finish or actually make my main component of it for 15 years from now, that to me is a great challenge and a great glory. That's the duel that I'd love to challenge those great masters to, because they were stuck in a dominant form. And I think that right now we're at the point where that's really breaking down in terms of film. The dominance of the feature film, I think, has ended. We haven't seen the results of it, but we're right there. That's what has occurred over the last couple of years.
An observation to pick up on what you were saying is, inherent, I think, in what you were saying is that we have this muscle memory that's built into all of ourselves, whether, and we have this sort of sense of control. Part of that is the sort of sense of ownership or control. And it's sort of, but how do we release this muscle memory? Is it just going to happen through the participation of audiences, through the loosening of through social media, because people are going to change the way their behavior acts, and is it going to happen from ground up, so to speak? I mean, is that what we're seeing? I mean, Susan, what are your thoughts on the muscle memory issue? Because you've probably come up against it many times, had to break through.
Definitely. I mean, I love movies. I'll just have to tell you that. And so, I think we, growing up, it's like, we all have had that experience where we lost ourselves in a world. And I think one of the things that all the people certainly on that list have is this, we've all left their media daydreaming about being in those worlds because they were so fully realized. We could actually put ourselves in it. So I actually think, and someone has said this before, that I think it's the meeting in the middle. We still need great storytellers. And I think, YouTube probably has proven without a shadow of a doubt that we're not all great storytellers. Can I say that authoritatively?
You can say that.
Okay. So, we need this creative force, coming and bringing these fully realized worlds to us. But I also agree very adamantly with Ted, which is if these creative forces can loosen up a little bit, there's ways to let people into your world that really can add value. And, and so I think, Ted mentioned that War of the Worlds told over payphones was a trick, but that's how we got everybody's attention. That's how we got above the noise. Because sometimes you can have the great idea, but still got to get people to know about it.
But my point was, the pleasure was that it was a trick. That people love that, in terms of like that moment that the guy had in Anchorage, Alaska, a place where you don't get to go out and certain things are still legal. So you have other things that help lead you to that kind of WTF moment.
Right.
We've reached a point, I think, in our, the muscle memory of how we receive stories. My 10-year-old looks at, Doctor Who and says, "Oh, I understand the code." And I'm like, "What?" It's like, "I understand the story code." It's like,
how old is
he? And he's like, "Yeah." That was like how I understood, okay, you don't watch whatever the children's series was, and you're going to have to start watching Torchwood once you get 2 digits, it's like you're breaking it down too fast. But that fact that, we still do tell stories, as we did 100 years ago in the movies, in the beginning, middle, and end. We recognize that when we see the handgun in the first act, it will go off in the third. And we understand that's way too programmed. And we no longer want that from that entertainment. We need to engineer the WTF moments where someone says, "Oh my God, it's someone who's insane who's directing this. How great is that?"
Right.
Chris Nolan. No, Chris. Sorry, Frank.
Yeah, I think that if I can go back to Lost again, another thing that I had in this discussion with Damon and Carlton was that they said that when fans come up to them and wanted to talk about the show, they basically got 2 reactions. And one was they wanted to be reassured that they knew that the producers knew where the story was going, that it was actually going to go somewhere. And the other was that they wanted to have some sense that they, the fans, could actually influence the story. And as Damon and Carlton said, these two impulses are actually kind of contradictory. Except that they're not entirely contradictory, as the conversation bore out essentially. What came out was that because television is such an iterative process, a TV series, unlike a movie where obviously the whole thing is made before anyone sees it. But with a television show, especially one that lasts over a period of years, there is a chance for the audience to provide feedback if the producers are listening. And certainly in the case of Lost, Damon and Carlton were listening. And the example they gave me was these two, lowlifes, Nikki and Paula, who appeared in, I think it was the middle of season 3, and that was before they had managed to set an end date for this series, so they had the producers had no idea how long the show was going to have to go on and how long they were going to have to spin this out. And so they introduced these characters, and the audience, viewers just went, wait a minute, we've been watching these shows for 2.5 years and suddenly 2 new survivors show up, and number one, and number two, we don't like these people at all, they're slimy, and get them out of here.
Rejected.
Right. So the audience rejected the new characters, and what Carlton said was, they listened to this, they heard this, and they said, okay, you want us to get rid of these people? All right, we'll not only kill them, we'll fucking bury them alive. And that's what they did in the show.
It's funny, one thing around that in terms of participation, like sometimes though you can, the people driving the experience can listen too closely and that can screw you up too.
Right,
like
right.
The first ARG, the Beast was this program that we did where you end up kind of like the vocal minority kind of, of course is going to give you more feedback than you'll ever want to deal with. And then you start chasing after kind of to please that like 0.001% of the audience, and then you end up kind of like alienating everyone else. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges in this kind of participatory way, as how do you balance the audience, even the guy that doesn't speak up, but they probably outnumber the people that do.
Right, exactly. And another example of this is Dickens, who, of course, wrote all of his novels as serials. They came out monthly, and he had barely finished, writing one series of chapters before he had to start on the next one. So that was a very iterative process as well. And he listened very carefully to his readership. He didn't always do what they wanted him to do. When in the old Curiosity Shop, when it became apparent that Little Nell was not really going to make it much longer, people went nuts. And there were practically riots in the street. There was a ship that landed in New York from England. It was a time when information traveled a little more slowly than it does now. And it was met on the docks by a crowd of people saying, "Is Little Nell dead?" And so in that case, obviously, Dickens did not listen to his readership. He knew what would make a good story. And he knew that as much as his readers said they didn't want Little Nell to die, secretly they did. And but there were other stories where, at times when the story wasn't going as well, like Martin Chuzzlewit, for example, when he did listen very carefully to the audience, to the readers, and so I think that's part of it. You have to know, when to listen and when not to.
I have to weave marketing in here a little bit because obviously it's interesting. My observation is that there's, a dearth of good work coming out of the marketing industry around, liberating themselves out of the way they've always done things. And why do we think that is? Is it again back to the sort of same old adage that you've got the same people with the same sort of muscle memory producing, the work? And what is it going to take to break out of that? Is it going to require just different types of teams? And again, I know you touched on this a little bit, Susan, but you obviously must work in a very creative environment, but with really interesting, multidisciplined, and I was also taken with what Chris was saying, was because also the sort of level of, and the attention to detail and the sort of detail that you need to go through is unlike the sort of detail that we tend to look at when you're producing marketing campaigns. So it's a sort of different way of actually building this whole sort of ecosystem of, and also having that flexibility to respond to things and not quite knowing where you're going to need to go. But you've got the people and the resources, or you're going to jump on it, which again, typically marketeers and more traditional storytellers often aren't flexible. So it was quite a long question, but it was, it's trying to weave in the whole marketing thing. And
well, coincidentally, where we started was how can we do something to get the attention of the marketing adverse? We now have the ability to program our lives. When we were first start talking about content to come out on the web in the 90s, we were like, oh, we'll just make programs and put them online, and at 8 o'clock on Tuesday, people will show up. Well, people don't show up because the internet is theirs, right? And you can do whatever you want with it. Your phone is yours, your tablet. It's like, I can program my life, I can TiVo, I can whatever. So I think that, if you look at the discontinuity or the change, the sea change that's happened, I think taking too long to embrace it is going to be fatal, right? So one thing is to recognize that, the sea has changed. So that's number one. And then number two is like, I think what we have seen with the marriage of entertainment and marketing is that if you can take what is the great attributes of the core property and you can extend that out, and it's now possible to do, there's no better marketing in the world. It's like, well, let's let people experience what your world or story is. And that requires a tremendous different type of setup than a traditional ad agency.
Well, it's something we're working on Naked, actually. It's sort of, I think psychology has long since understood that Freud was out and cognitive behavioral psychology is in. And yet, a lot of marketing still follows the sort of theory of Freud theory, which is we're sort of going to, keep asking the question why, and we're going to reflect as opposed to, and I think what it's doing, and essentially it's sort of, one of the marketing sort of golden rules was AIDA. Awareness drives interest, drives desire, drives action. But actually the whole thing has now been flipped on its head. And if you follow cognitive behavioral strategy or psychology, and you'd say, it's all about actions. It's all about these actions which actually drive, interest, desire, and then probably awareness in that fashion. So I think that's also, having a huge impact on the way in which. And of course, the digital age is social media. Obviously, digital is the perfect place for action. But it's how do we then take that action into less traditional media, or into the traditional media and things like that.
I think where it really starts to change is where we start to place the value on the communities that we create around our stories. Much in the way Chris was saying, with bees or anything, that people wanted to hear what the stories other people told. That's what kept bringing them back, was the social component. And when we do that, we get a little bit more distance from being like on point, on message. I've a couple times been able to get the marketing departments, in the film industry, it's a real problem because no one wants to give up any piece of their budget.
Yep.
And on Adventureland, a movie I did couple of years back, we were able to get the marketing department of Miramax to give us money to shoot additional content. We were in an amusement park. We had young actors who were booked for run of the show, and I got two Funny or Die directors to come aboard and just we'll invent stuff. And we made training videos for the amusement park from the period, and we made a documentary. One of the characters ran around hitting everyone in the balls, and we did a kind of anthropological look at the different ways that's done and all of that. And we delivered this stuff that was very funny. Miramax looked at it and they said, this is not on message. This is not on point. We don't know what to do. And I kind of think that as we start to recognize the community, we also recognize, I'm not on message all the time.
Yeah.
I don't need it. I still like to go back to that world. I relate to that character, not the one that's punching the balls. The Jesse Eisenberg one I related more to. But and it gives us that reason. If we put the value, if we say, we built this huge 2.5 million people for Batman, we're not going to let them go. We're going to keep them there and feed them more things.
Well, and actually, and it was actually 11 million people who participated in The Dark Knight because people want to live in Gotham City, and there were 6 decades of dreaming about it. But I do think what you're saying is incredibly important, which is the internet has provided us a tool to be very targeted. So, I watched Lost because I wanted Jack and Kate to get together, obviously. Which I was able to clearly influence the writers to make happen. But other people are watching for completely different reasons, And so I think it gives you the ability to say, okay, well, you're watching for this reason, that way. We can give content to you. It's not $1 trillion, and we can make you feel like, oh yeah, they're validating why I think this material is cool, or this world is cool.
So I'm going to ask the panel one more question, and then you guys please think of some really smart questions, because I'll then open it. Janine, are we okay on time? Yeah, great. I just wanted to ask each of you, who's inspiring you at the moment, or what's inspiring you? Maybe not just who, but what's inspiring you in what you're doing, in how you're thinking about new things, new books to write, Frank, or the work you're doing at Google, Chris, and I'd just love to, maybe I'll start with Frank, because you've got Furtive Mind and you're interviewing people, and
sure.
Who is it? Who or is it what?
I mean, this is a little odd, but I find that there's a whole generation for which the stuff that we're talking about and trying to sort out just comes entirely naturally. And a few weeks ago, I had brunch with this guy who was down from Boston, who had just graduated from BU. His name is Nate Goldman, and he had done he had spent 2 years as an undergrad putting together, for no credit or anything, this sort of War of the Worlds type zombie experience that took place over a variety of different media, primarily his college radio station, but also he got people to dress up in the streets and all kinds of stuff. And to him, this was just utterly natural. This was just how you would do something like that. It was, he did it without any particular resources except for access to the radio station. He had never heard of transmedia or, Henry Jenkins or my book or anything until after it was over. And I thought that was brilliant. I thought this is, in a way, in my wildest dreams, I'm John the Baptist.
Chris?
One thing, I guess, if I look at who am I really impressed by, one thing on YouTube that I'm amazed by is that where the top partners on YouTube, these guys who create these web series, are amazing to me, because not only do they have to create the content, they have to market the content. They have to they become this they're ABC, but they're sitting in their bedroom creating all this, and some of them now are making big bucks. I mean, so just this, and it's kind of the same thing. They probably have no idea, when they started, they were going to become a network unto themselves. But people now that know that they have not only create the content, but how to foster and grow a community, I'm just amazed by it.
Susan?
So just to echo what these guys are saying, I think for me, what is inspiring to me is actually seeing people go after these sacred silos and saying, well, I'm not going to do it like that. I'm going to do it differently. And, I look at, I think they do quality program HBO, but they're also thinking about what is it people really want. And they're launching things that give people access to content that is kind of counterintuitive. You're like, well, if we give them access to next week's episode this week, then who's going to come back and watch it next week? But in fact, they're just kind of feeding the frenzy because people feel like, oh, okay, well, we are somehow participating in all this quality entertainment that's coming out. But I think the thing I'm really looking for is kind of what we're saying, which is someone who is not in any way, no 1 foot, toe, finger, whatever, stuck to the notion of traditional media models. They just are like, well, we're just going to do it like this. And then everyone's going to look and go, oh, yeah, we were stuck over here, so we couldn't see that. But now that we see it, we can all go for that.
There's a lot of great work that's being done out there that inspires me on a daily basis. The thing that I struggle with most, and what I'm always looking for, is the folks who are willing to slow down to try to tell a big story. That in the independent world, people write their script and they think they can make a movie right away. I've been working for about 3 years with a filmmaker named Lance Weiler, who is in some ways the most famous filmmaker that nobody knows, but we've been doing a transmedia build, working a long time on the script to make sure that the story element of it truly holds up and has enough openings in it at the same time that it can last for a much bigger world. And along the way, he's been willing to do what he calls a lot of story R&D, things that whether they're events or installations or films or apps, putting things out into the community, letting people play with it. Kind of some of this Frank touches in his book, emergent storytelling, emergent gameplay, really not needing to succeed, in making a masterwork of art at an early stage, but willing to let's see how people play with it and try to adapt that. But really the part that for all of there's tons of visionary, like whatever he did at age 15 that didn't come my way in pill form, I really, I wish that I had gotten hold of, but but the thing that's really most impressive to me is the willingness to I don't have to produce it overnight. I don't need to be proclaimed, a genius. I don't need to win the Sundance Film Festival, get picked up. I can actually try to manage something. I'm going to engage a lot of people, and I'm going to depend on the crowd for us to try to get it right. That to me is very inspiring.
Yeah, no, that's great. I echo it. And I think actually, my only comment would be celebrate the brilliant misfits. It's sort of, that's what we try and say at Naked, is we're always trying to hire the brilliant misfits. Clearly everyone wants brilliant people, but...
I've got a list.
Yeah, but anyway, that's a nice segue because, I know that there's, I think, some friends of Google in the audience, and certainly I think there's a number of people from, I think, Brilliant Misfits in the audience, because I've had the pleasure of working with the Creative Lab and some of the sort of amazing people that are working there. So I'd love to throw it open to the audience to obviously ask anyone any questions. I think there are microphones here, or we're a relatively small audience, so just shout your question out if you've got any. Please.
I would second that. I work with Lance, and I've worked with him on a couple of projects, and he definitely gives up authorship, and he starts small, which is fantastic. So he's always tweaking things as he's going through a process. I work for Ogilvy Entertainment on trying to harness social media and gaming for social change. And a wall I come up against daily is that social change isn't really exciting to audiences at their core. What's exciting to people is conflict. But obviously I'm working with big brands, and brands don't want to be associated with conflict. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's, obviously lots of people are always coming to us saying, well, how can we use this for good? And going back to what we were able to see in year zero is you can't tell people what to care about, but you can set up a construct through which they see the world through different eyes. But you're really at a conflict yourself, because you just pointed it out, because great storytelling has conflict. You know, so you can't really put someone else in someone else's shoes unless you create that drama. So, I mean, I believe in that entertainment, and like we've seen it, there's a million examples we can point to, films that made us think differently about the world or an issue or a situation. So I think that this media as well, you have to stick true to good quality storytelling. You know, you have to put people in the world, in the situation, in the story, and you can't just expect them because it's for good. You can't tell them what to care about. We can't tell you people what to care about either. You know what I'm saying? It's like, no, we're just going to think for ourselves. So like, what you can do is bring them into a world of story where they experience it personally, and it changes the way they see the world. That's my 2 cents.
Question at the back.
Hi, Toby Daniels. Just to go back to something you were just talking about, this idea of building stories iteratively over time, starting small and taking longer to create, which obviously sounds fantastic, but who's investing in those types of projects? Who has the sort of the vision to be able to back those types of artists and allow them to get on with their craft, but over like a 2, 3, or even perhaps a 4-year period?
Yeah, I wish I knew that answer.
And do you have their telephone number?
It's hard, you know, particularly in the tech world. There's always ways to raise funds for, you know, experiment and innovation. It's a lot harder in the content business for that. I think that part of the problem, we're also relying on a financial model that is, again, based on, you know, generally either feature film dominance or ad, you know, based television. You know, so how do we start to move to something else? Because certainly if I can bring a community together, you know, that stays together over a long period of time, and all I'm doing is selling them a ticket, you know, or a download to a movie, I'm not a very good business person. If I can find people's, you know, liked interests, you know, I should be able to drive a fair amount of different forms of commerce, you know, through that community. You know, I think that part of the problem is we're probably still all looking at old revenue models, you know, for it, as opposed to something that's more of a new revenue model. You know, if we're bringing people together and they're responding to the things that we like, they're revealing a great deal of data that's useful to a lot of different people, too.
I actually think, too, that this is an opportunity, right? Because you don't have to open a movie on opening weekend to get your world out there. You can do things on much smaller platforms and start building an audience. And that's a huge way in for a lot of people that didn't have a way in before. So I think it's a big opportunity.
I mean, if you look at, you know, Marvel and DC, you know, basically comics were a great, inexpensive way for character generation and testing. You know, had they had the business plans that they would become the big entertainment, you know, entities that they are today, you know, I don't know if anyone would have believed them, like, well, this is what we're going to do. We're going to publish on cheap pulp paper, you know, for 40 years, and then we're going to make $100 million, you know, celluloid, you know, things. But
Stan Lee, yeah. An interesting observation, I think, is that I hate to plug another book, but there's a book by a friend called Peter Sims, and it's Small Bets, and have a read of it. And I think it's just interesting. He's talking about a lot about small bets. You know, we have this tendency in Hollywood and in marketing and in, you know, what's the big idea? You know, everyone's looking for this big idea. And actually the greatest successes of today were these iterative successes where they placed small bets and they made mistakes and they learned by the mistakes, and it's sort of, you know, that's the theory behind the book, and it's just sort of this notion of how you know, experiment. You were talking a little bit about, you know, the loosening yourself up into that experimentation mode, but I think we're going to see so many more, you know, amazing business plans come out of small bets and being able to, you know, lose small but learn from it. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, just to add on that, I just think that that's the beauty of the web and the fact that costs are coming down, and I think it's where, you know, people can produce their own short stories or films and tell their own stories in a way that you could never. The barriers to entry are just so different, that, and if you can find an audience, then it goes from there. So it's kind of about, you know, if you get the momentum behind you, I think sky's the limit.
Well, are there any other burning questions? Any other burning questions? Yes.
I was wondering what your views are on the anonymity of authorship on the internet. And for instance, there's recently the guy that was supposedly like a lesbian somewhere, and he was actually some married guy in Sweden, and how we're being tricked into things and what we should do about that or how we can get around these issues.
Anyone want to take that? Frank?
I would just like to point out that on the internet, everybody knows you're a dog. You know, as with the purported lesbian who, you know, it comes out soon enough. You know, I don't know. I think that's another example of the kind of blur that I was talking about. It's obviously impossible to make sure that everybody is exactly who they say they are. And I suppose in some way that's part of its charms.
Well, I definitely have an answer for that in terms of creative content, which is don't perpetrate a hoax, because people will find you out. And I think that what you end up being, and like what we've always tried to do, is provide a clever way to invite people into the story that's buzz generating and cool. So then they go, oh, well, I saw that and I did that. But once people are like trying to debunk you, the internet has infinite resources. Do you know what I'm saying? They will figure it out, and as in this case,
Yeah,
they'll
right.
figure it out. So don't start that way, you know, because you will get figured. Like, did anyone see the movie Catfish? I mean, like, you know, other than being also sad, but you know, I mean, it's just like you will get found out. You know, it's so don't throw down the gauntlet because somebody will pick it up.
Or, you know, program the hoax into it at all times. Like, that's the point, that it should be
The
exposed.
reveal.
Yeah.
I don't think you can program the hoax into it the whole time, but that's not in this day and time. Not since Google.
No, but the fact that it's going to be discovered is part of the...
Well, on that moment, just as the discussion was about to get
Sit down
heated
the
and
first
Susan and Ted were about to rant. Anyway, I'd like to first and foremost thank Frank. Well, firstly, I think thank Google for hosting this event. You know, mega thanks to Janine and the team at Creative Labs and everyone for coming out on a hot, steamy day to be in a nice, air-conditioned, lovely catered venue. Thank Frank. The Art of Immersion, I think everyone's got a free copy of the book. Amazing book. I've read it twice now, and I'm giving it away to all my friends, and I think it's going to run and run. Thanks, Frank. Chris, Susan, and Ted for being great panelists and for you know, just stimulating the debate. Thank you, everyone.